Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to episode 9 of the Hello Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Neumann, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Andrew Neumann. Andrew, how are you today?
I'm doing well, Dan. A little bit of a wrinkle today to today's show.
Yes, there is. We are live from the northern studio of the Hello Old Sports podcast on the banks of the Hudson, also known as Andrew's apartment. In fact, we are only about a mile or so from the banks of the Hudson River, and this is our first podcast that we are ever recording together, both in the same place and, as we said, in our hometown here in New York, about 90 minutes north of New York City. And for that reason, we thought that Army football would be a good topic for today's show, really for sort of two reasons. First of all, the location and where we're recording from. We thought it would be a good time to talk about something that was very specific to this area that we are in. And then second of all, when this episode airs, it will be early December, just about time for the annual Army-Navy game, something which has a little bit of a different twist this year, as a lot of sporting events do. So we thought we would do a little bit of a dive today into the history of the Army-Navy game and to Army football generally.
Exactly. So you mentioned we're just not very far away from the east banks of the Hudson River here in Poughkeepsie, just a little bit away from the water. And then if we go right across one of the few bridges between here and West Point, you would be able to travel to the west bank of the Hudson River, the famous S-curve, which is where West Point is located, placed there for strategic purposes during the American Revolutionary War. And we will be talking about the Black Knights of the Hudson, which was their unofficial name until I believe the 90s, when they finally settled on officially being the Black Knights, the Army Black Knights. They had always been known as the Cadets, but having the Black Knights as an unofficial name, and now they are officially the Army Black Knights. Just as by way of a little bit of context, I am a season ticket holder of Army football. I have been this would be the fourth year, had this year taken place as normal. So during that time, growing up here, people went to Army games and we knew a little bit about Army football, although generally it was always that you go and they lose and they go 2-10, but it's still a fun day. And that's changed in recent years. But like my brother said, a very different year as we record this the day after Thanksgiving. The Army-Navy game is scheduled to be played on December the 12th at West Point, which is the first time since 1943, and before that it was, in the very early 20th century that they played games on the campus sites. And in addition, not only will Army-Navy be at West Point, the Army-Air Force game will be the week after that, because they were scheduled to play in early November, which is their traditional time, and because of coronavirus within the Air Force Academy, it was moved until late December. So obviously some outliers that people in 20, 30, or even 50 years, when they do an Army football special sports podcast history thing, we'll be talking about, but we'll try to be a little less contemporary in what we're talking about today.
Absolutely. So I think there are some very specific eras in Army football that are noteworthy and that are worth diving into a little bit. I think it's also probably worth, as we go through here, talking about some of the rather obvious reasons why Army football and Navy football are very different than your average Division 1A college football program. But why don't we start at the beginning? And Andrew, did you want to talk a little bit about the early days of the Army football program?
Sure. And like you just mentioned, and just to lay things out, we're going to save most of the talk about the Army-Navy game for the end of the show as kind of its own segment. That doesn't mean in some places it'll be unavoidable if we're talking about a championship Army season or something. We'll have to mention, and they beat Navy in the last game of the season. But the actual specifics of crucial Army-Navy games or the tradition around that, we'll save that for the end. But in this case, we do have to talk about the first Army football game took place in 1890. It was Army against Navy. Technically the coach, more like a student manager of those teams in 1890 and then in 1892 was a guy by the name of Dennis Mikey, who was a cadet at the time. It's spelled Michie, and the name rings a bell to a lot of people these days because the stadium at West Point, where all of Army's home games are played, bears his name. It is Mikey Stadium. That first game, Army was beaten 24-0 by Navy. It was the only game that Army officially played that year, but that was the beginning of their football and also the beginning of a rivalry that continues to this day.
And I think we've talked in the past about how when you look at what football actually was in the 1890s. It's not like baseball in the 1890s where, sure, there are some differences, different number of strikes, maybe a shorter different distance between the mound and the batter's box. Football in 1890 is very different even than football 20 to 25 years later.
Exactly. Really think about when you talk about baseball, it's like kind of the beauty of baseball is that so little has changed that you tend to focus on the things that have changed because a lot of it looks exactly the same, where the positions are and what the players are and how many outs in it. Football, especially college football, not that there was pro football in 1890, but college football has always been very era specific. And when you're talking about really anything prior to 1920, it's a barely recognizable game to what we know today. But football's sort of a natural tie-in to the military academies being such a military-esque game, especially back then. But when you think about territory and gaining yards and, possessions and things like that, it's really not hard to see in addition to just violence, which at that point was much more unstructured than it is today, really not hard to see why that would appeal so heavily at first to the cadets and midshipmen at a military academy and later to the brass as a way, of these military academies as a way to encourage camaraderie and discipline within the schools.
Advance and retreat and 11 players on a football team more so than in any other sport, really. So all of that ties in with the general military culture idea. So what else is worth noting from the early days of Army football? So
the one thing, and I know we mentioned we'll talk about the Army-Navy game later on, early days being pre-1900, it was a Navy player, but in 1893, the Army-Navy game was the first game ever where a football player wore a helmet. Midshipman by the name of Joseph Mason Reeves, Reeves, played the Army-Navy game in 1893 in a helmet because he had been told that basically one more blow to the head could kill him. So in order to play in that game and continue his football career, he wore a sort of crude helmet to protect his brain, I guess. Now, who knows how effective that actually was, but it's still a significant first, I believe.
Yeah, very interesting. I feel like even with the advances in helmets and technology in this day and age, if a player was told one more blow to the head and you will likely die, I don't think they would bother to even try and play even with a helmet.
Exactly.
But different times in the 1890s.
So we'll skip it. We're going to skip ahead a little bit. When you talk about unless you have something to get to, when you talk about the 1890s, if you look, they're playing 6 to 8 games a year, doing well, but it's really very hard to quantify exactly what some of this means. Like if you were to just pick a year at random, let's say 1897 Army, they went 6-1-1, and if you were to look at some of these teams they played, you wouldn't even necessarily recognize any of them as schools that currently exist, let alone having football teams. here were their results in 1897. They played Trinity, which was in Connecticut. They played Wesleyan, which was in Connecticut. Harvard, Tufts, Yale, Lehigh, Stevens, and then Brown. So lots of Ivy League schools and
plus Stevens.
And Stevens and Trinity in Connecticut that you've never heard of really, or certainly aren't known these days as football powerhouses. And another thing to sort of point out, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century, most of the time, for most of those years, they were playing all of their games at home except the Navy game. For a very long time, they were not traveling. They would play all their games at West Point on a place called The Plain, which is still there, but it's basically just one large sort of open, flat field that's now sort of like it's a spot on the tour with the statues and things like that.
Why wouldn't they travel?
I don't know the exact reasons. I think A was cadets weren't leaving base all that often back then to begin with. Mm-hmm. And then B, probably costs were involved and worried about mischief making and things like that. But my guess is for the most part that it had a lot more to do with keeping all the cadets on the base. It wasn't, football at the time, they were probably getting some special treatment, but it wasn't the special treatment that they would get today, even at a West Point or at a military academy. It was probably like, well, the rest of the men don't get to leave base to have fun. You guys don't get to leave to have fun either.
And I think that's sort of an interesting window into what college sports in general was in the early 1900s. The football team was considered no different than the debate team or the choir, that type of thing. It was all just activities for the students outside of the classroom. And so you see it reflected in the extreme there sort of with Army, but really even at the regular school, colleges and universities, it was considered more of a club type thing and an activity, not something the school would center its entire business model around.
And one thing that will come up as we go through this, especially up until the, really from this era we're talking about now until the 1960s, there was at best a frosty relationship often with the brass of the school, who were all high-ranking military members, and the football program.
Yeah.
How high a profile they wanted the football program to have, how much special treatment they wanted the program to have. It's important to sort of note that even today, especially today, while it's not Alabama or Mississippi or Clemson, and in some ways it's harder because they're also going to these practices, West Point cadets, and I'm assuming midshipmen at Navy and the cadets at Air Force, do get some special treatment in terms of being allowed to go off base and stay in a hotel the night before games, even home games, and being allowed to be excused from certain meals that no other cadets, even other athletes, are allowed to miss. I'm not making a judgment on that, but sometimes there's sort of this equivalence that there is still a delineation between the football players at West Point and the regular cadets, just like there is at any other school.
Well, they have to do something if they want these guys to come play there. They're already at so much of a loss as far as the military commitment and just the general culture. You have to give them some level of privilege, or else nobody's going to come to the school.
Just as an example, and then we'll go back to the timeline. This was at the Naval Academy, but it's a similar thing. I know an issue a few years ago was that the head coach at Navy had asked the academy if his players could have their dress code eased a little bit, or classes, not necessarily the uniform, but specifically the shoes. He said the fact that they have to wear these tight, polished dress shoes all day was, and I don't remember how that was resolved, but it's something nobody else has to think about at any other academy or any other college in the country except for really these three. One era I wanted to highlight before, 1919 is going to be something that's really worth discussing, but I do want to touch 1914 through 1914 and 1916. They went 9-0 both of those seasons. They actually in 1913 went 8-1. So, in the lead up just before World War I, some really good teams that went undefeated. Again, tough to quantify. We'll look at the 1916 team, for example. You're not going to see a lot of the powerhouses, and there were powerhouses at the time. It wasn't certainly the schools that you look at now, but they went 9-0 in 1916 playing Lebanon Valley, Washington and Lee, Holy Cross, Trinity, Villanova, Maine, Springfield, and then two big ones against Notre Dame and Navy. So 9-0, but they didn't win a national championship, or not one that's recognized today because of the schedule that they played.
And I believe future President Eisenhower is on the team in about that time frame, maybe a little earlier. He was probably in the first decade of the 20th century, but there's a book out there called Carlisle versus Army, and Eisenhower, actually as a West Point cadet, plays against Jim Thorpe and the Carlisle Indians in an exhibition game. The other thing that's interesting to note, and it probably doesn't necessarily to continue to this day, but the Army-Notre Dame rivalry is something that is very prominent for several decades, probably up to some point in the 1950s. And interestingly enough, and maybe we'll get into this a little bit later, these Army-Notre Dame games that the Army brass expects to be a home game for Army, they fail to take into account the heavy Irish Catholic contingent among the population of New York City and the greater New York metropolitan area. So oftentimes these games at Yankee Stadium or wherever it is end up being more like Notre Dame home games, even though Army is the ostensible home team.
So a big turning point came in 1919, and it wasn't an immediate turning point on the field, but it was more in the attitude of the school towards football and the ultimate investment of resources in football. And the reason it's also significant is because two of the names involved were much more prominent later on, one in Army football history and one in American history. And that was in 1919, there was a cadet at the school, Red Blaik, who went on to become the coach years later, and he formed a relationship with the newly incoming commandant of West Point, Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur had been at West Point as a cadet in the early 20th century, was not a football player, was a guy who was small in stature, was kind of a utility man on the baseball team, but had been a manager on the football team, recognized the value of athletics and specifically football at West Point. So when he came back in the late 19-teens, he took over, and a big issue had been they had a cadet commit suicide in the dorms on New Year's Day. And that was obviously a major thing, both for what it was and for the public relations aspect of it. So when MacArthur assumed command of West Point I'm reading now from a book on the 1958 team called When Saturdays Mattered Most by Mark Beach, but it obviously covers Blaik's whole tenure at West Point, both as a cadet and then as an assistant coach and going forward. So one of the things that MacArthur did was look to get hazing under control. He formed a committee of cadets to sort of discuss things, and one of the people on the committee was Red Blaik. And it says the relationship between Blaik and MacArthur grew even closer as a result of the superintendent's obsession with Army football. 2 decades earlier, McCarthy arrived at West Point as a gawky teenager, etc., etc. And then upon his return to West Point as superintendent, MacArthur quickly set about establishing himself as Army's #1 football fan. Whenever he could make time in his official schedule, he liked to summon Lieutenant Elmer Oliphant to headquarters for a visit. Oliphant was a young assistant coach, but just a few years before, he'd been an All-American. I'm paraphrasing a little bit. MacArthur got inside perspective on the team, while Oliphant received weekend passes to travel upstate New York, where he played as a semi-professional player in Buffalo. And then it talks about how during the war, this would be World War I, which MacArthur had just returned from, MacArthur had been profoundly impressed by how well athletes among the Army's officer corps had performed in combat compared to non-athletes, and he took note of how greatly enlisted soldiers tended to admire accomplished sportsmen. And he also vigorously promoted varsity sports with the goal of raising the Academy's national profile. No longer would Army leave West Point only to play Navy. MacArthur sent his teams out into the world. In 1921, their cadets made their first trip away from West Point to New Haven, Connecticut, to face mighty Yale. But just obviously an interesting, and there's a famous quote from MacArthur that you will still hear at Army games today and is on plaques. And he said, "Upon the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that upon other fields on other days will bear the fruits of victory." And that is a very famous quote, both in West Point athletics, and then specifically Army and the Army-Navy game. And you'll often hear about the fields of friendly strife in relation to West Point athletics in general.
You've been to a lot more games than I have, but MacArthur's legacy is very much sewed into the fabric of what you see on a Saturday at West Point for a football game, whether it's quotes, whether it's just he is very much alive in the legacy of Army football, especially when you factor in the fact that He didn't actually play on the team.
Yeah, and he left the academy in 1922 to continue his military service. That was all of the, obviously, high-ranking people at West Point are still active-duty military. For a long time, up until really the 50s, the coaches were all active-duty military, so they'd rotate after a few years. But MacArthur kept his relationship with West Point, and specifically with Blaik, in this same book later in 58. And remember, this is 1958 now, so everything that's happened with MacArthur has already happened. The campaign in the Pacific in World War II, being fired by Truman, he's really now, in 58, he's set up in a hotel in New York City, kind of living a life of holding court and impressing people. And every week he would meet with Blaik. They would talk on the phone almost every day, mostly about football. So it wasn't just while he was there he cared and then left. Even during the war, he was, out while he's fighting in the Pacific, commanding the troops in the Pacific, he was in regular contact with people, specifically Red Blaik, about those championship Army teams. So a real turning point there in the 20s, late teens, early 20s, during that brief period where MacArthur really put football and athletics in general into the forefront, and the dividends sort of paid off and continued, that it was just the expectation that football at West Point is to be regarded as an important part of the school's mission.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the Army-Notre Dame rivalry, so we'll kind of continue along that path. There's a couple of different eras to it, but the 20s is really the era that it really gets going. Like I mentioned, Army was becoming a higher profile school in terms of football. They'd had their runs, but also college football was becoming the sort of it thing in the country other than baseball. It was the biggest sport. They played for the first time in the 19-teens. They actually played pretty much yearly, but in 1920, starting in, I guess really every year except 1918, from 1913 to, they played really every year until till 1947. From 1913 to 1947, with a couple of exceptions, they played every year. They had some big games, mostly at West Point. Notre Dame mostly getting the better of them until 1925, when Army beat them 27-0 at Yankee Stadium. And then they kind of rotated wins for the next few years, and the reason I'm mostly talking about this era was 1928. November 10th, 1928, at Yankee Stadium was the game where, at halftime, with Army holding a small lead, Notre Dame coach Knute Rockne delivered his famous speech, and we actually talked about this guy in our 1920 sports episode, the non-baseball episode. We talked about George Gipp, who had passed away at the end of the 1920 season. In that halftime locker room 8 years later was when Knute Rockne delivered the famous Win One for the Gipper speech, where they then went out and defeated Army at Yankee Stadium. I believe 12-6 was the score in 1928.
It's amazing what the legacy is that you don't realize of college football in the New York City area in that time period. You think of college football in these days as very much a Southern and then a Midwestern phenomenon, and then I guess third would probably be the West Coast. There's, California, Oregon, Washington even. The Northeast is probably the part of the country that is the least associated with college football. And then if you take it even further, New York City is probably the part of the Northeast that's the least associated with college football, because you still have Boston College, you have Penn State, obviously.
Pitt, if you consider Pittsburgh, and
D.C. area's got Maryland.
The Virginia teams are sort of related. If you were to ask people, really the program that's even moderately a big-time program in New York, closest to New York City, would be either Rutgers, who always stinks, Syracuse, who's not much better and is still several hours from New York. St. John's and Seton Hall don't have football teams, or if they do, they're not big-time football teams. I don't think either of them have them anymore. Stony Brook on Long Island is not going to move the needle. West Point, being 2-10, you're right. It is probably the low point of college football relevancy in the country is New York City and the New York City area.
Absolutely. But as we're learning, it wasn't always that way. So we talked about Red Blaik, and he has a very long and storied career. Did you want to talk a little bit about him and then maybe segue into the 40s a little bit?
Absolutely. So while we're talking about these teams in the 20s and stuff, they're putting up good years for the most part, winning records overall. Coaches, again, changing kind of yearly. Biff Jones, Ralph Sass, Gar Davidson, William Wood. And then in 1941, Red Blaik takes over. He had been an assistant at West Point. It's interesting to note his military career was actually over very quickly. After he graduated from West Point, it was, in the early 20s, and I think he did some time basically being like a rancher for the military in Texas or somewhere in the West Coast, or somewhere in the West. And basically as soon as his career, he was able to, left the military, became a football coach. After he realized he was not going to get the head coaching job at West Point, went to, I believe it was Dartmouth, and had some good years as the coach there, and was finally brought back to West Point in 1941 to take over for a team that had gone 1-7-1 the year before, and would hold that job for 18 years, which was at the time, again, nobody really had the job for more than a couple of years at a time, and saw what is really unquestionably the greatest era of Army football ever, specifically from 1944 to 1946, but there were also some other excellent teams in that era. But Blaik, having been there for 3 years, you want to introduce us to the era that started with 1944?
So it's really led by Mr. Inside and Mr. Outside. Mr. Inside is Doc Blanchard, and Mr. Outside is Glenn Davis. And these are two running backs who joined the team. I don't know if they joined the same year, but by 44, they're both on the team, and then they lead Army to an unprecedented 3 national championships in a row, 44, 45, and 46. And
the 46 one is disputed by Notre Dame, but
yes,
unquestionably in 44 and 45 and in 46, they have at least a claim to it.
Home of the greatest football machine ever assembled is West Point's famed Michie Stadium. Many a football reporter, including yours truly, Bill Stern, faced with the job of choosing an All-American, says, "Brother, just give me those cadets. They're all Americans," which is pretty much the truth and no great mystery, particularly when you consider Army's coaching staff. Beaver Bevan, who trains the cadets to the peak of physical perfection. End coach Stu Holcomb, one of the finest wing mentors in football. Head coach Red Blaik. The way the Colonel's unbeaten teams play speaks for his football greatness. Andy Gustafson, coach of the runningest, blockingest backfield that ever wore cleats. Line coach Herman Hickman, who schools speed and savvy into the Army forward wall. Assistant coach Jabo Jablonski, in the Gridiron Hall of Fame as both player and coach. Now, that great Army team. And Hank Folberg, fast downfield under punts and passes, a demon on defense. Tackle, Al Nemitz, slashing, hard-charging, fast, smart on offense and defense. Guard, Art Jeremetta, pulled out of the line to lead Army offense. Center, Hug Fusen, one of Army's best all-around gritters. He doubles as halfback. Guard, team captain Johnny Green, also cadet captain. Steady, brilliant, and inspiring leader. Tackle, Tex Calder, potentially the finest tackle in collegiate football. End, Dick Pitzer, great diagnoser of plays and a dead-eye pass catcher. Halfback, Shorty McWilliams, a slam-bang blocker, a speedy ball carrier. Quarterback, Arnold Tucker, probably the best signal caller operating out of a T formation. Fullback, guess who? Right the first time. The one and only Doc Blanchard, fast, powerful, smart. Everybody's All-American. Along with halfback Glenn Davis, considered by many as the finest change-of-pace runner the game ever saw. There's no room on Coach Blaik's team for prima donnas. Great as they all are individually and collectively, Red's formula calls for full-time football from every man. Let's take a gander at what makes the cadets click.
So 44 in Blanchard's it was 40. So 44 and 45, they clearly won. 45 and 46 were the two Heisman years. And the interesting thing is you look at their numbers each of those years, and they both had a case each year to have been better than the other one. So in 45, the year that Blanchard wins the Heisman, he's got 101 carries for 722 yards and 16 touchdowns. Meanwhile, Davis has 85 carries for 930 yards and 15 touchdowns. So really, Davis had more yards that year than Blanchard did. And then the next year in 46, when Davis wins the Heisman Trophy, he has 712 yards and Blanchard has 613. So very similar numbers as well. And over that period of time, 9-0 in 45, 9-0 in 44, And then in 46, the reason there's that dispute is they went 9-0 in 1946 with their one non-victory having been a tie against those same Notre Dame Fightin' Irish at Yankee Stadium again in 46, I believe it was. A 0-0 tie in what was one of the games of the century, I'm sure it was called.
Davis is tackled on the final play of the game by Johnny Lujack of Notre Dame. Lujack, who in addition to being a defensive player is also the Notre Dame quarterback and the 1947 Heisman Trophy winner. It's also worth noting that Davis and Blanchard would occasionally only play half of the game because Red Blaik had this habit that some other coaches had, but Blaik was well known for it, was somebody who would basically have platoons, but these platoons were not offense and defense. These platoons were one group of 11 would play the whole first quarter, and then another one would go in for the second, and then the original would go back in for the third. He would waver from this from time to time, but by and large, he uses this system. So it's really worth noting that these two amass some of these statistics, despite at times only playing half of the offensive snaps, and I think that might account for some of the carry numbers that you have there.
And also, remember, when they're playing half of the offensive snaps, they're playing half of the defensive snaps too. The rules fluctuate a little as the years go on, but college football did not have free substitutions until the 60s. So basically, like in this book I'm reading on the 58 team, I know the rules from then, but they were largely the same in the 40s. If you took a guy out during a quarter, he could not return to play until the next quarter. So what would happen a lot would be, you'd have your starting offense, specifically your quarterback, who'd have to then play safety, or, usually you'd keep him as far away from making tackles as he had to.
And getting blocked.
So what you would do is, if you started with the ball, maybe you'd leave your quarterback in for a drive, you'd get through one defensive drive with him in there at safety, then you'd have him, have the ball on the second offensive drive, and then if there were 5 minutes left in the quarter, you'd take him out for the second defensive series, which means if you went back on offense that quarter, he wasn't coming back in until the second quarter. So you'd continue to have those sort of things. So like we said, talking about the 1890s, we're now even talking about the 40s, and it's not a recognizable thing. We think of football, especially because pro football went to free substitution so early, that we don't realize that this late, it was still, that's why those numbers seem so kind of off-kilter.
504 points for Army in the 1944 season versus only 35 points given up. They defeat Navy for the 1944 national championship. They win the Army-Navy game, which entitles them to the national championship. It's, I believe, the only Army-Navy game that's ever played for a national championship. Army and Navy are 1-2 that year. It is worth noting that there are some advantages that the military academies have in the recruiting of players during this time period.
And during World War I as well, but specifically during World War II also.
And there are obviously, as there always are with these type of rules, there are all sorts of minutia that you can get into. But the sort of upshot is basically that if you enroll in one of these military academies, you will not be drafted until your class graduates. And also, you will then enter the military service as an officer as opposed to as just an enlisted soldier. And so in sort of an ironic twist, young men often use enrollment into one of the military academies as a way to stall military service, with the hope that by the time 4 years is up, that the war will be over and they'll enter relatively less dangerous military service. The other thing that's worth noting is that during this same time period, Army and Navy are able to have players join their teams already played 4 years in college football, so they enjoy that recruiting advantage as well. So
that was what happened with Red Blaik in World War I. Think about him as Mr. Army football, one of the most important people in the history of Army football. he had played, I think it was 3 years at Miami of Ohio, and then was able to go to West Point for 2 years during World War I. And for a lot of these people, think about Red Blaik, graduated in 1919, was able to, that tactic worked.
Absolutely. So it is the golden age of Army football, but I think it definitely does come with a big asterisk. So if you're ever having a conversation with somebody and they say, oh, well, there were days when the military academies were competitive, if not dominant, in college football, there's a lot more to that story than you might realize as far as why they were able to be so dominant. Just a couple quick things. Davis and Blanchard, once their class graduates, they have to complete their military service. Blanchard never makes it to the NFL, but Davis does actually play 2 years in 1950 and 1951, and he plays with one of the better teams of the era, and that's the LA Rams in 50 and 51. He makes the Pro Bowl, actually, as a halfback in 1950 on a team with Elroy Hirsch and Tom Fears and the 2 Hall of Fame quarterbacks of Norm Van Brocklin and Sonny Jurgens. So part of not only these great Army teams, but at least for a couple years, sort of the great LA Rams high-powered offense of the early 1950s. He retires after the 1951 season because of a lingering knee injury that he had obtained a few years previous while filming a movie that starred himself and Doc Blanchard about their time as Army football players. And if you give me a minute, I can look up the name. But
Sure.
It was not a football injury. It was a lingering injury from a movie that ended the career of Mr. Outside, Glenn Davis, but not before a couple of years as a somewhat of a star with the Rams.
So zooming ahead a little, while Glenn Davis was playing his brief career with the Los Angeles Rams, you mentioned 1951, and that brings us to our next very important point in Army football history. And this was a scandal. It was known as passing the poop, which is going to come up a lot, but that was what the scandal was called. So in August of 1951, there was an article in the New York Times, the title of which was West Point ousts 90 cadets for cheating in the classroom, football players involved, written by Arthur Daly, the famous New York Times sports columnist. It is a stark, sickening reality. 90 West Point cadets, perhaps half of them athletes, face expulsion for violating the honor code. And the honor code is another thing where if you hear anything about military academy, specifically West Point, the wording of it is something along the lines of a cadet will never lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate anyone who does. And basically what it says is, obviously, if you do anything against the rules, you've obviously broken them. But also, if you know about it and allow it to go on or don't take it through the official channels, you're considered just as guilty. Which, in a military school, you can understand why that's important. So, I'm going to read directly from the 58 book again. It says, the cheating that precipitated the expulsions involved a ring of cadets that had been formed to pass along the questions and answers to daily quizzes and midterm reviews. It first came to attention of the Academy's administration in April of 51, reported by a member of the swim team who had refused an offer to join. The scheme was simple. Relying on the honor code, professors gave the same daily writs quizzes to every class and administered them without a proctor. It was an irresistible temptation. Members of the ring who took a quiz in the early period would pass along the questions, known as passing the poop, in the slang of the ring members, to cadets who were to take the same writ in a later class. If time permitted, smarter members of the ring would also work out the answers and pass them along. The practice, according to the findings of the Academy's investigation, dated back to at least 1947. A witness in the inquiry said a ring had been started by football players for football players. One of the players involved in it was a cadet on the football team named Bob Blaik, who was summarily expelled from the school along with all of the other players, was Red Blaik's son. And I think we need to just sort of underscore, A, how big a scandal this was, really that there was any kind of a scandal with West Point football, and B, that how close it came to Red Blaik either being fired or being forced to resign, not necessarily because his son was involved, but because this had gone on under his watch.
The movie was called The Spirit of West Point, just for anybody who was curious. One of the other players who was implicated in the scandal was a player by the name of Ray Malavasi, who was later I don't know, he went and played, he finished up his career somewhere else, and then eventually was the head coach of the Rams in the late 1970s, was the coach when they went to the Super Bowl in 78 against the Pittsburgh Steelers. So another noteworthy name that gets tripped up in that scandal. It's an interesting time period because it's right around the time of the CCNY point shaving scandal in basketball in sort of the same general metropolitan areas. So the previously viewed, I think there was an idea that college sports was this pure amateur endeavor of clean-cut American boys going out there and doing their best for their alma mater, and even more so the case in West Point, where you're talking about not just the college, but sort of the pride of the country and its army as a whole, coming off just a few years after World War II. So this really does shake the entire campus, not just the football program.
Exactly. Like you said, it's a couple years after World War II, Blanchard and Davis and the Heisman trophies, and, Eisenhower's about to be the president. Everybody knows that's going to happen. He's a famous West Point man. To circle back to Blaik's role in this, players did go to him right as the story broke. He sent them to the commandant's office. He told them to follow the rules and self-report, and, knowing what the consequences was going to be. But just as I was reading this section, circling back to sort of the contention, this ties a few things up nicely. The tension between even a guy like Red Blaik with the administration of the school, and it talks about the open recruitment, which is what they called it during World War I and World War II. Said Blaik was aware that not everyone at West Point held Army football in high esteem. He knew ordering his players to the commandant's office, he was sending them into the lion's den. And then it says Harkins and his coterie openly sneered at Blaik's public persona. In their opinion, Blaik was a draft dodger who had gone to West Point as a young man to play 2 more years of football rather than fight for his country in the First World War, and had assumed the rank of colonel during the Second only because he demanded status equal to the Navy's coach, who usually held the rank of commander. Now his power far exceeded his position, and they felt he was allowing players to openly flout academy directives at the same time they were being indulged with special privileges. So this was a monumental thing, sort of to the modern eye, and thinking about modern schools. It's like, well, yeah, guys told people what the test questions were going to be, but in the time and also in the place and who was involved, it was monumental to the country.
The other thing that's going on in Army football in the early 1950s is Vince Lombardi is an assistant coach with the Black Knights, with the Army football team, and Lombardi for the rest of his life would always hold Red Blaik in great esteem. Lombardi lasts with Army, I believe, for about 5 or 6 years.
49 to 53 he was there. So he was there during the scandal.
He was. And sort of he then leaves to go to the Giants and then later to the Packers. But during this same time period, Lombardi is getting his start as I think he'd been an assistant at Fordham, his own alma mater previous to that. But it's always sort of been said that Lombardi really learns to coach and learns a lot of his ideas about discipline and football and how the two go together under Red Blaik.
And one thing that I was going to mention later, but so you talk about Lombardi at West Point as an assistant from 49 to 53. Well, about 15 years later, while Vince Lombardi was winning Super Bowls at the end of his run with the Green Bay Packers, there was another assistant at West Point on the football team who mentioned that one of the things he did, on Sundays after they played on Saturday, was he would on campus go to another coach's house and watch a lot of the Green Bay Packer games, at least the ones that were on TV at the time. and sort of learned a lot and really admired those Packer teams. And that coach, who also spent 4 years at West Point before going on to other things, was Bill Parcells.
That's right.
So just kind of an interesting, if you read his most recent autobiography, he talks about how he would go and watch the Packer games on Sundays, which was like really their only time off, and really admire, it was the end of that run, but both guys from the same kind of general area, and, both obviously had quite a bit of success in the NFL.
Another assistant who serves under Blaik is Sid Gilman, who goes on to be sort of an offensive guru for the San Diego Chargers, wins a couple of AFL titles in the early days of the AFL. So a lot of, and you see it in basketball later on with Bobby Knight, Mike Krzyzewski, a lot of coaches who you might not necessarily think of as being associated with Army were at some point early on in their careers.
So let's talk about the last season Red Blaik was there, the last great Army team in terms of this national of a profile, and that was 1958, and that's the book I've been quoting from a lot was called When Saturdays Mattered Most, about the 1958 Army team. And the reason it's called When Saturdays Mattered Most is when you think about the end of that year, the year 1958 was the Giants-Colts NFL championship game, the greatest game ever played, which really vaulted the NFL into the stratosphere. And perhaps more than anywhere else, just sort of in general, the service academies were really, perhaps nobody was hurt more by the rise of the NFL than the service academies, because, prior to this, some guys went on and played pro football, and you could make some money doing it, especially in the 40s and 50s compared to the teens or the 20s, but you didn't necessarily go play big-time college football with your only goal being to play in the NFL. Now, from the late 50s on, if you were an all-American class caliber recruit from high school, you had your eyes on the NFL before you even picked a college. So knowing, if I go play here, I have to go into the military for 5 years. Even if you're not necessarily worried about the dangers of the military or the war, a war that might be going on, you're not going to the NFL, at least not right away. So where in the past it might have been seen in the 20s and 30s and 40s even as like, hey, I'm guaranteed a job when I graduate from this college. Now it's like, well, I know I'm not going to the NFL. So again, lots of factors for why Army's not winning national championships these days, but that's something that bears mentioning.
Yeah, the only player from a service academy that I can think of that's gone on to any sort of stardom or any sort of meaningful career for that matter in sort of the post-AFL, NFL merger era is Roger Staubach. I don't know if there's others. Who's the lineman for the Steelers right now?
Ali Villanueva.
Yeah.
And this is sort of zooming to the end, but there's been some back and forth where that rule was lifted and they allowed, because they figured there was such a small number of guys who go from these service academy teams to play professional sports that they agreed to sort of waive your immediate military service. You still have to fulfill your commitment, and they kind of have you do it in off seasons, and instead of going right to active duty and then into the reserves, they kind of have you go into the reserves first. But you're talking single digit guys. Most of the time that digit is 0 each year. So they had allowed that rule, then sort of reversed course in the last few years and said, no, you have to immediately fulfill your military service. And now they've re-reversed themselves and are back to, hey, if you're a player and you play at West Point or the Naval Academy or Air Force and you're good enough to get a contract with a professional sports team, go ahead and do it. And the reason for that is PR. They know that it's a good PR to have guys who are technically active duty military, playing in the NFL every week. So back to the 58 team itself. This is Red Blaik's last year. Hadn't been announced ahead of time or anything like that, but what this year is known for is what's called the Lonely End. And this was where Red Blaik had run a very traditional offense for years, and going into this season in 58, he decided to totally throw his playbook out the window and came up with an offense where he would have one receiver, was a guy named Bill Carpenter, who usually filled this role, was known as the Lonely End. He was split way out wide. He wouldn't even run back into the huddle. I guess after the first game or after the first quarter of the first game when they got a penalty, the referees said that he had to come back within the numbers on each play. But he was spread so far out for the time that they didn't want him wasting that much energy running back and forth to the huddle. So a totally different offense. They threw the ball a lot more than they certainly did back then. The numbers don't blow you away, but they threw the ball, over 200 times that year, it looks like, or close to 200 times in a 9-game season. So that's 20 times plus a game for Army football in 1958 is pretty remarkable. Joe Caldwell was their primary quarterback, but the real star of the team was Pete Dawkins, who was the Heisman Trophy winner in 1958. Wasn't their leading rusher, only had 428 rushing yards, but also had 494 receiving yards, 11 total touchdowns. Bob Anderson was their leading rusher. The Army team was ranked as high as number 1 that year. They had beaten Notre Dame. It was the first time they played Notre Dame in about 11 years because that rivalry got so heated and sort of became a sideshow that the schools both decided to end it. They did beat Notre Dame. They were number 3. Notre Dame was number 4 when they played in October. Army won, which catapulted them up to number 1, where they stayed for a couple of weeks. And in late October of 58, they went to Pittsburgh to play Pitt. They tied that game 14-14, which knocked them down in the rankings. They won the rest of their games, including a victory over Navy, 22-6. And they very likely could have won a national championship had they gone to the bowl they were invited to, which I believe was the Rose Bowl. Army, much like Notre Dame back then, and a lot of schools, and there were a lot less bowls back then, but would not play in bowls. I don't think Army played in their first bowl game until 1984 or 83, sometime in the early 80s. Now, for most of the 60s and 70s, it was a moot point.
Yeah.
They were not invited to any. They would not have been invited to any bowls, but a lot of schools, I know Army's stance was always, well, Navy is our bowl game. But had they played in a bowl game that year and won it convincingly, may have won a national championship. Instead, they finished 3. Dawkins wins the Heisman Trophy, and then at the end of the year, Blaik announces his retirement.
So a few things there. First of all, Dawkins ends up going on to a military career and then later a business career, and actually I think it's 1988, runs unsuccessfully for the Senate.
And I believe if you read about that, it was a notably nasty campaign. I remember reading about that.
Yeah, and I think one of the charges was he didn't really have many ties to the state he was running in, which was New Jersey. But he's not elected to the Senate. He's defeated in his Senate race. I was looking, you were right. The first bowl game for Army was not until 1984, which was interesting because Navy seems to have played in them, at least on a semi-regular basis, several decades earlier. So I don't know what the reason for that was, but Army waits all the way until 1984, and that's something that you would just never see, let alone a service academy. Maybe you might see it, but any other school turning down not just a bowl game, but a chance to win a national championship, that's just unheard of in this day and age.
Yeah, I mean, and we're going to talk about sort of the down points here, but as I look, and again, back then when 6 and 5 didn't get you into a bowl game, the last couple of years they probably would have even had any shot at a bowl were the late 60s. After that, they were, mostly below 500 or just a game over until the early 80s. So who knows how early they would have accepted a bowl game, but we know it wasn't in 1958. That was actually when I went to the Army spring game a few years ago. There was somebody down on the field, and you could tell he was getting a lot of attention. Like, as soon as he came onto the field, it was a guy dressed nicely with silver hair and a suit. And as soon as he came onto the field, the head coach, Jeff Monken, kind of ran over to talk to him. And you're at an Army game or a spring game, you expect there's going to be, like, luminaries there, or that there might be. But the difference with this guy is he wasn't wearing a military uniform. So I was like, I wonder who that is. And then I found out later via the Army website that it was Pete Dawkins was there. So to see a guy who had won the Heisman Trophy 60 years before that at the spring game was pretty neat.
It is, and at the risk of sounding morbid, the chances that Army is ever going to have another Heisman Trophy winner is probably pretty slim. So he is, from the point of view of this football program, very much sort of a living treasure in that he will be the last Army football player ever to win a Heisman Trophy in all likelihood.
So we're going to zoom through a little bit of the rest of this until the modern era now. But so after Red Blaik retires, Dale Hall takes over. And from the late 50s through the late 60s, they're mostly winning seasons. There's a couple of 8-2 teams in 66 and 67, which would have been when Parcells was there under a coach named Thomas Cahill. So again, they're nowhere near like finishing in the rankings in a year. They're playing light schedules, but they are still putting up winning records. And then in 1969, it was when it really things start to make a turn. They finished with a losing record in 69. In 70, they're 1-9-1, and then couple of good years right over 500 after that, and then the era begins. They're 0-10 in 1973, and then do not finish with a winning record. They finished with a winning record in 1977, but from 1969 until 1981, 82, 83, most under 500 all but 3 years. Most of those years you're looking at 2-9, 3-7, that kind of thing. So really the first big fall. And just one thing I wanted to point out from that era, 1979, they go 2-8-1. The head coach of that team was only the coach for 1 year, was Lou Saban. Nick Saban's father. I'm not sure what Nick Saban's age was at the time, but his 1 year as head coach at West Point was 1979.
And I believe Lou Saban played in the NFL for the Browns in the 40s and 50s under Paul Brown. So just sort of a side note there.
So then we get to the 80s where the head coach is Jim Young, and again, we're talking about the first bowl games they played in. They played in actually 3 bowl games in 5 years. In 84, they went 8-3. In 85, they went 9-3, actually entered the rankings at one point in 85, although they didn't stay there. Played in the Cherry Bowl and then the Peach Bowl. And then in 88, they went to the Sun Bowl at 9-3. They did lose that game. That's 3 bowls in 5 years, their first 3 bowls. And then once again, a couple of good years in the late 80s, 88 or 89, 90, just over 500. Young leaves, and Bob Sutton takes over, and you get to a run here in the 90s with one exception, which we'll talk about, where they're either below 500, just under 500. Then in 96 was, called the 58 team, the last great Army team. If we had done this 5 years ago, we'd be saying the 96 team was the last even decent Army team.
And I remember that prior to your getting season tickets, that was the last time they'd been to a game, and they started the season something like 7-0 or something like that. It was a decent year for them.
Yep, they finished 10-2. They actually finished ranked. They were ranked 25th. They got as high as 22nd at one point in the year. They were, let's see what their record was. They won 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They actually were 9-0 before they went, and they were ranked 22nd, and then they went to Syracuse, and they got killed. Then they beat Navy. I believe that game was at Giant Stadium. They beat Navy, and then they went to the bowl game. They played against Auburn, and they lost by 3 at the Independence Bowl in Shreveport, Louisiana. So 10-2, 10-1 in the regular season. Only loss was to a team that was ranked higher than them. Really good year. Started off with that great 9-0 season, but it just wasn't sustainable. From 1997 to 2009, they were no better than 4-7. Any of those years, their best season was 4-7. In 1998, they made what is seen as a catastrophic mistake going forward. All of these years up until this point, they're an independent. Mm-hmm. And obviously, tons of schools were independents. But as conferences became a bigger and bigger deal, more teams joined conferences. In 1998, Army makes the decision, or they probably made the decision off of the strength of the 96 season. But in 98, they join Conference USA. It's an unmitigated disaster for them. It comes at a time when they're already, trending in the wrong direction. But the years they're in Conference USA, which is 98 through 04, 3-8, 3-8, 1-10, 3-8, 1-11. 2003, they became the first team in college football history to go 0-13 because they played Hawaii, so they were allowed to play a 13th game. And then 2-9 in 04 before they went back to being an independent. So now, I guess the big issue, too, because I've heard people talk about this, not only were they bad and it didn't help them at that time to not be able to handpick some of their games, but also, and the same is true now, think about lower conferences as it relates to TV. Army loves to play Saturdays at noon, Saturdays at 3:30. They have their routines for everything. Suddenly, Conference USA is telling them, well, ESPN wants you to play on Thursday night. ESPN wants you to play on, Wednesday, and that's really... So now the one thing Army's always had going for it, which is people like going to the games even if the team stinks.
Because it's a whole atmosphere of the day and the skydivers bring the game ball down and all that stuff, and now you lose a lot of that.
Exactly. So they backed off of that, didn't really change their trajectory. They're just burning through coaches. After Bob Sutton left, it was Todd Berry. Todd Berry's years were 1-10, 3-8, 1-11, 0-7. So Todd Berry was fired in the middle of his fourth season, but he was 1-10, 3-8, 1-11, and 0-6. Then they bring in Bobby Ross, the former Lions coach, and he takes over for a couple of years.
Bobby Ross was the former
Chargers coach. That's right.
He had taken him to a
Super Bowl, but he doesn't do any better. Stan Brock, Rich Ellerson. There's one sort of brief, decent season in 2010. They go 7-6. They get to a bowl game. It's one of the lower bowl games again. Back in the time when we're in the era now where 500 gets you a bowl game. Falls right off the cliff, and then in 2014, Jeff Monken, their current coach, takes over, and it's really been a renaissance in Army football. Again, they're not going to go back to winning back-to-back Heisman trophies and back-to-back national championships. If they can win, I always say, if they can make a bowl game a little more than half the time, and if bottoming out is a year where they go 5-8 instead of 3 straight years where they go 1-12, that's kind of the what I think the standard ought to be. But since Monken has taken over, his first year they were 4-8, or then second year 2-10, but then since then 8-5, 10-3, 11-2. Had an off year last year at 5-8, and now this year they're 7-2. Finished as high as 19th in the 2018 rankings. Had a 14 game straight home winning streak. Army football is basically at the highest point it's been sustained probably since the early 80s at this point.
Do you think that there's anything that Monken has done differently to make the program more competitive, or do you think there maybe are just other factors at play?
I think he has done things differently, but it's hard to – I don't know that I can enumerate them.
Okay.
I think, I don't know. I mean, he certainly seems like the right guy to coach an Army team, but some of these other guys probably did as well. I think he's able to – again, if you're Army – you're recruiting against either the Ivy Leagues or the other military academies. What you need to be able to do is win recruits against the other military academies. You want to hear, oh, this guy was considering Navy and Air Force and picked Army. You're not going to hear he was considering Florida State and picked Army. And you're hearing more of that. And I think also he's got a firm commitment to the triple option offense, which Army's traditionally run, but they've experimented a little with getting away from it. But I think he's a firm believer in that. And then strategic scheduling is important for a school like Army as an independent. Mm-hmm. You know, I think it's not unfair to say if you're Army, and I mean, this will be able to segue nicely from the big thing Jeff Monken's done, but, you know, you want to strategically schedule. You know you're going to have your other military academies, and you know you're going to want maybe 1 or 2 higher profile games. But other than that, they play a lot of MAC teams, a lot of Conference USA teams. And the fact is, if Army can go 9-3 while playing a weaker schedule, it's better than if they play a nationally prominent schedule and go 4-8.
One of my favorite sports authors is John Feinstein, who's written a number of really good sports books, and his most famous is A Season on the Brink, where he followed around Bobby Knight and the Indiana basketball team for an entire season in the mid-1980s. He, in the 90s, wrote a book called A Civil War, which is the story of a single season of Army and Navy football and culminating with the Army-Navy game. And one of the points he makes in that book, which I had never really thought of, but in most other programs, a player has a lot of reasons not to want to leave the football team. The player at Penn State or Miami, if they leave the football team, chances are they're going to lose their scholarship, and that means they're leaving college as well. At the service academies, everybody is already on a full government scholarship, so the players, if a player leaves the football team, they're just getting extra hours back in their day for sleeping and or studying. Now, I know, as you said, there are some concessions that are made, but I don't think anybody would deny that a football player at a service academy faces a heavier time commitment than even the already heavy time commitment that players not on the teams face. And so what you sort of end up with is you end up with players who really, really want to be on the football team.
And the other thing, too, is if you're at West Point, and by the way, you mentioned John Feinstein still writes a weekly column on the Army website after every game.
I did not know that.
I mean, he did as of last year. I haven't checked it this year, but it's called Feinstein's Findings, and he writes after, like, each game. He's obviously not doing it because he has to. He's obviously a writer of much higher prominence, but the other thing, too, like you mentioned, so every cadet at West Point has to play a sport every season. Now, if you're on the varsity football team, they don't make you play intramural softball in the spring, but whether it's varsity or club or intramural, so if it's club, you might play other schools, club teams around the area. Every person has to be on some sort of athletic team every season. And if you're on varsity, I believe your off-season training counts for that. So it's not like, you just, I'm not on the football team anymore, so I'm going to stay at home. The way it works, when you're at Army, and I'm assuming the same is at Navy, you are free to leave up until you've completed your second year. You are free to leave like any other athlete or any other student. No penalty. You can leave. You can transfer, whatever. What happens at the beginning of your junior year? I believe that every grade at West Point has its own nickname. So the seniors are the firsties, the freshmen are the plebes. I get mixed up on which one are the yearlings and which one are the cows, but I believe the juniors are the cows. The start of your junior year, you sign a commitment. They usually have a ceremony where you sign like one long piece of paper, but then you individually sign a commitment. And what you're doing there is you are saying you are committing to finish your school and then your military service. So you can still leave. And you can leave, even if you graduate, you can leave. But what happens if you don't fulfill your military service, they send you a bill. For your 4 years of schooling, which ain't cheap. So that's where. But if you're a sophomore and at the end of your sophomore year you say, you know what, military's not working for me, the school's not working for me, you can leave like any other school. But you can also, there's no red shirting, so you don't get to, if you get injured or if you have another year of eligibility for some reason, the school won't let you, or they never have in the past let you play that fifth year.
Hi everybody, this is Dan. We had originally planned this episode as an all-in-one episode about both Army football and the history of the Army-Navy game. But as you know, as often happens when Andrew and I start talking about sports history, the conversation went a little longer than we'd expected. So we figured instead of cramming everything into one long episode, we'd split things up and turn the Army-Navy part of the conversation into its own episode next week. So tune in next week for episode 10 of the Hello Old Sports podcast as we talk about some of the great moments in the history of the Army-Navy game, one of the oldest rivalries in college football. And remember, find us on Facebook at facebook.com/HelloOldSports or email us at hellooldsports@gmail.com. We'll see you next week.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.